Small towns. Big secrets. We follow the evidence, not the rumors. Crime Key Secrets. Find the key. Unlock the truth.
Ed Gein, the monster next door. Have you ever watched a horror movie so real it made your skin crawl? I'm talking about Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. 3 films that, on the surface, seem completely different, yet they share one soul. One name that every investigator in America still remembers in haunting detail: Ed Gein. They called him the Butcher of Plainfield, but to me, he was the man who opened the gates of hell for the 20th century. His crimes weren't just shocking because of their brutality. They terrified us because they revealed something deeper, a fear we'd never dared to name before. That monsters don't always live in the woods or in the graveyard. Sometimes they live right next door, smiling, waving, offering to fix your pipes on a winter afternoon. When the Gein case broke in 1957, America was shaken to its core. No one could believe that the quiet, soft-spoken man from Plainfield, Wisconsin, the one who helped his neighbors, chatted with kids at the grocery store, was also the man who dug up graves, carved flesh, and crafted furniture from human skin. But when the door of that old farmhouse finally opened, the world changed forever. I still remember something a colleague once told me. The most horrifying crimes often come from the most ordinary people, and that's what made Ed Gein truly terrifying. Not just because he killed, but because he forced us to question everything we thought was safe. From his case, America began asking a new question. What turns a human being into a monster? Is it genetics, upbringing, or the quiet kind of loneliness no one ever notices? When I revisited his case files, I didn't just see blood and mutilation. I saw traces of division between a world that looked moral on the outside and a world of chaos hidden deep within. And Ed Gein stood right at the crossroads of both. He grew up on a cold, isolated farm, under the rule of a fanatically religious mother, a woman who preached that women were the root of all evil, that the outside world was filled with sin. He had no friends, no love. Only his mother, the woman he both worshipped and feared. When she died, Ed lost his compass. It was as if the lighthouse went dark. And in his desperation, he tried to bring her back. Can you imagine that? A lonely man, standing in the middle of a snowy field, digging into graves at night, collecting skin and bones, trying to rebuild the mother he lost. Sounds like fiction, doesn't it? But it happened. Every grotesque detail of it. What haunts me most isn't the crime scene itself. It's how calm Ed was when he talked about it. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't even tremble. He described dismembering bodies with the tone of a craftsman explaining how to carve wood. That's what we call compartmentalization. The ability to separate one's actions from one's moral awareness. To Ed, killing wasn't a sin. It was a ritual, a craft, a way to bring his mother back to life. I've met many disturbed criminals in my career, but Ed Gein was a turning point. After him, America never looked at crime the same way again. His story pushed investigators, psychologists, and filmmakers alike, to explore the darker corners of the human mind, to understand how love can twist itself into horror. Without Ed Gein, there might never have been Norman Bates, the quiet, repressed motel owner in Psycho, or Leatherface, the human skin masked killer in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Buffalo Bill, the delusional tailor of human flesh in The Silence of the Lambs. They were all shadows, born from one real man, Ed Gein. But I'm not telling you this story just to scare you. I'm telling it because I want you to feel that fragile line between normal and insane. Because sometimes, the only thing that separates us from men like Gein is the fact that we still hurt when others hurt. Someone once asked me, do you really believe a normal person could become someone like Gein? And I said yes. If you strip away connection, love, empathy, and leave a soul trapped in isolation long enough, the monster inside eventually wakes up. When I look at cases like this now, I don't just see crime. I see a distorted mirror of humanity, reflecting our deepest fears about ourselves, our loneliness, our obsessions, and our ability to justify what we know is wrong. So I want you to picture this. A cold afternoon in Wisconsin. Snow sweeping across an empty field. An old farmhouse. Silent and dark. Smelling of rot and dust. Inside, a man sits alone, stitching pieces of skin together, believing he's doing something right. No screaming. No chaos. No blood spatter. Just silence. The kind of silence that's far more terrifying than any scream. And from that silence, America learned how to listen. Listen. Listen to the silent cries of twisted souls. Listen to understand. To prevent before another Ed Gein walks among us. This isn't just the story of a murderer. It's the story of how society created him and then recoiled in horror at its own creation. A past of control and isolation. If you want to understand Ed Gein, you have to go back to where it all began. A small farmhouse in the frozen fields of Wisconsin, where every sound seemed swallowed by silence. From the outside, it looked ordinary. A weathered country home. Rusty roof, smoke rising from the chimney each morning. But inside, it was another world entirely. A world where religion was twisted into a chain, and a mother's love became a prison for the soul. The woman who ruled that house, Augusta Gein, was a religious fanatic. She believed every woman, except herself, was the embodiment of sin. She taught her sons that the world outside was the devil's playground, that women were temptation, and that only Scripture could keep their souls pure. She didn't just forbid Ed and his brother Henry from having friends. She forbade them from even speaking to women. I once read a statement from a former neighbor. She said, "That boy Ed never heard a good morning from anyone but his mother. He went to school with his head down, never spoke a word to another child." The father, George Gein, was the complete opposite. A weak man, an alcoholic. His voice held no power in that house. He was little more than a shadow working in silence, enduring humiliation, and slowly drinking himself into oblivion. Two boys grew up trapped between a silent father and a domineering mother. If you've ever heard of Stockholm Syndrome, when a victim begins to love and believe their captor, then Ed was a perfect example. He didn't just fear his mother. He worshipped her. To Ed, Augusta was God, the judge, the voice of truth, the decider of right and wrong. That kind of love wasn't love anymore. It was devotion, blind, fanatical. His brother Henry was the only one who saw the danger. He once told a friend, "Mother's destroying Ed's mind." Henry pushed back. He argued, tried to pull Ed away from their mother's grip. But then, Henry died. A field fire, 1944. Official report. Accidental. But in one of the old case notes I once reviewed, there was something strange. When firefighters found Henry's body, it was barely burned. But there was a wound on his head. Ed was the only one there. He was the one who led police straight to the body. No evidence. No charges. No one wanted to believe that the quiet, gentle younger brother could have done it. But in our line of work, we have a saying. Sometimes, silence is the loudest confession. After Henry's death, it was just Ed and his mother. A year later, Augusta suffered a stroke. Ed cared for her day and night, feeding her, praying beside her, orbiting her like she was the sun and he was her shadow. And then she died. In that moment, it was as if the axis of his entire world collapsed. I want you to picture this. A man living alone in a small house. No friends. No family. No one to talk to. Every belief, every ounce of emotion, every idea of right and wrong, all tied to one woman. And then she's gone. He didn't just lose his mother. He lost his identity. When we later analyzed Ed's psychological profile, one expert told me, Augusta's death didn't just take away his mother, it took away his sense of reality. From that moment, he began to drift into a world of his own, a place where his mother never died, where death itself could be undone, where he could recreate her from the remains of others. Horrifying. Yes. But if you study criminal psychology, you'll know every extreme act begins with a wound too deep for the world to see. When investigators finally entered Ed Gein's house, they found one room untouched. His mother's room. From the day she died, he had locked it tight. Dust-covered but perfectly preserved. The bed neatly made. The old Bible yellowed with age. The picture of Christ still hanging above it. Each time he passed the door, he would stop, whisper something like a prayer. That room, pristine, sacred, stood in the middle of a house filled with human remains. It was the perfect symbol of his divided mind. One half worship, one half destruction. Half of him was the dutiful son, the other half a killer. You know, once I interviewed a woman who had seen Ed in church one Sunday. She told me he sat in the front pew, singing softly, head bowed in prayer. Everyone thought he was such a good boy, but his eyes, they didn't look at anyone. They looked through people like he wasn't really there. I never forgot those words. Because that's what isolation and religious extremism can do to a person. They make you believe in a world of your own. And when the real world no longer fits that belief, you try to fix it no matter the cost. Maybe if someone had ever reached out to Ed, ever talked to him, ever listened, things might have turned out differently. But no one did. To the people of Plainfield, He was just the quiet, odd man, the strange but harmless neighbor. No one knew that inside that farmhouse, the ghost of Augusta still lived, still whispered, still commanded him every night. And so, out of loneliness and loss, Ed Gein began to change. From a gentle son to a hunter of the dead, from longing to obsession, from devotion to horror. In my files, I once wrote, Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. He was made by a controlling mother, a childhood without light, and a society that never asked the question, what happens to a child who's taught only to fear and never to love? The horrific discovery at the farm. November 16th, 1957. Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small, quiet town like any other day. Only one store opened early that morning, Bernice Worden's hardware shop. She was a familiar face in town, a kind woman everyone liked. But that morning, her store stayed closed. Her son, Frank Worden, the town's deputy sheriff, used his spare key to check inside. The door wasn't locked, but something was wrong. The counter was knocked over. A trail of blood stretched across the floor, out into the snow. And the last handwritten sales receipt on the desk had just one name, Ed Gein. I want you to picture the atmosphere that day. A small town where everyone knows everyone. A missing woman. Blood on the snow. And the name of the harmless oddball suddenly appearing like a shadow. Frank called the sheriff immediately. The first report was short, just one line. Missing person investigation. Suspect, Edward Gein, resident of the Plainfield farm. No one on that team knew. They were about to step into one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. By the time police reached the farm, it was dark. Snow covered the fields. The wind cut through the trees like knives. Ed's farmhouse stood alone in the distance. A decaying wooden house. No lights inside. The door slightly ajar. One officer later said that when they pushed open the barn door, the smell hit them like a wave. The stench of rot, blood, and burnt flesh. They raised their flashlights and froze. Hanging upside down from the rafters was the body of Bernice Worden. Decapitated, gutted, like a hunted deer. No one spoke. One officer vomited on the spot. Another stood paralyzed, flashlight trembling in his hand. As they searched the house room by room, they realized this wasn't just a murder scene. It was a graveyard, a museum of horror, handcrafted by Ed Gein himself. Inside, everyday objects, chairs, lampshades, coats were made from human skin. There were masks sewn from human faces, bowls fashioned from skulls, even a belt studded with women's nipples. A veteran officer later said, "I fought in the war. I saw death up close. But I'd never seen anyone turn human beings into decorations. Every corner, every drawer, every floorboard held some trace of human remains. And then came the worst discovery: a full human skin suit, a woman's skin stitched together with eerie precision, complete with face, chest, and shoulders, Ed Gein had worn it. Walked around his house at night, pretending to be his mother. When I read that part in the report, I had to stop because it wasn't just madness. It was ritual born of unbearable loneliness. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed to possess the image of the woman he could never let go of. A twisted way to heal what could never be healed. A psychologist once said, Gein didn't seek the dead for the dead. He sought them because they reminded him of his mother. As investigators combed through the property, they found even more remains, many belonging to women who'd never been reported missing, which led to a chilling realization. Before Bernice Worden, Ed Gein had been robbing graves, digging up bodies of women who resembled his mother, in age, in build, in face. He even kept a grave map in an old notebook, carefully marking the spots where he'd found his gifts, as he called them. One officer later said, "At some point, I stopped feeling like I was standing in a man's home. It felt like an ancient shrine, a place where someone worshipped a god made of flesh and bone." When police finally arrested Ed, he didn't run. He sat quietly in the station, eyes distant. When they asked him why, he answered simply, "I just wanted my mother back." He said it not with fear, not with guilt, but with a strange, reverent calm. It's as if, in his mind, this wasn't evil. It wasn't even wrong. To him, it was the right thing to do. I once told a young investigator, when you walk into a crime scene that's too horrific to process, look for the emotion behind it. Because it's that emotion, not the knife, that's the real murder weapon. And in Ed Gein's case, the weapon wasn't a blade. It was love, twisted into obsession. It was worship, distorted into madness. It was loneliness, stretched so long it finally snapped. The full crime scene photos were never released, partly because they were too grotesque, but also because the police believed to look at them was to lose faith in humanity itself. After that night, Plainfield was never the same. The townspeople burned Gein's house to the ground, as if fire could erase what he'd done. But how do you erase something like that? You can't, because the monster didn't live only in that house. It lived in something far closer, in the darkest corners of our own fear. The fear that evil can wear a kind face. In all my years of investigation, I once told a reporter, I've seen cruelty in many forms. But Ed Gein wasn't just a case. He was a warning that when you strip away love and feed blind devotion, you create something worse than death. A world where humanity is skinned alive, leaving only the monster underneath. The human skin suit and Ed Gein's obsession. I want you to imagine this: a lonely man, living in a decaying farmhouse in the frozen plains of Wisconsin. The windows sealed shut through the long winter, the wallpaper peeling, the floorboards groaning under decades of rot. Inside, there's no life, only the damp smell of mildew, the tang of rusted iron, and a scent that anyone who's ever walked into a murder scene would recognize immediately. The smell of human decay. That was Ed Gein's world after his mother died. The only woman he ever loved and feared. To him, she was everything. His moral compass, his universe, his God. When she died, What was left of him cracked open, and that emptiness filled with guilt, isolation, and a warped form of faith began to consume him. During interrogation, Gein spoke with eerie calm. He said he wanted to become his mother. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But for those of us who've studied criminal psychology, it's not unfamiliar. It's called dissociative identity transfer. When a damaged mind tries to merge with the person it loves or fears the most. For Gein, love became religion. Religion became guilt, and guilt became madness. He believed women were the root of sin, yet at the same time, believed that if he could become a woman as pure as his mother, he'd be saved. That's what led to one of the most horrifying chapters in American crime. At night, Gein began digging up graves, not to steal jewelry, but to take bodies. He'd bring them home carving, stitching, molding, like some deranged craftsman working in a workshop built by the devil himself. And what he created was a woman's suit, made entirely of human skin, a mask, a vest, even gloves. He wore it in front of a mirror and whispered, "I'm back, Mother." I once spoke with a retired investigator from that case. His voice still trembled after all those years. He told me, "You know, when we opened that closet and saw the skin suit hanging there, I stopped thinking of him as human. It felt like something beyond man, something that had slipped through the cracks of creation." We often say in this line of work, no one wakes up one morning and becomes a monster. They're built piece by their pain, their beliefs, their isolation. And Ed Gein is the most chilling example of that truth. Some people ask me, why didn't he kill as many as other serial murderers? The answer is simple. For Gein, murder wasn't the goal. It was a means, a way to resurrect the one person he could never let go of. Have you ever lost someone so deeply that every sound, every scent, every object pulls their memory back so vividly it hurts to breathe? Now imagine that feeling, twisted by loneliness and religious guilt, multiplied 100 times. That's where Ed Gein's mind broke. I'm not defending him. But if you look closely, he didn't kill for pleasure or fame. He killed out of a delusion, a sick belief that he could bring his mother back from the dead. That kind of pain, when left to rot, can turn into a knife sharper than any steel. Today, Hollywood still borrows from his story. Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Silence of the Lambs, because Ed Gein isn't just a story about murder. He's a mirror, one that reflects the broken edges of the human soul, and it forces us to ask, if someone is taught that love is a sin and fear is sacred, what kind of person do they become? Maybe Ed Gein never truly believed he was killing anyone. In his mind, it was a ritual, a transformation, a way to touch something holy that he'd lost. But for the rest of us, his story remains a warning that monsters aren't born. They're made by loneliness, devotion, and unhealed pain. And if you've ever wondered, could there be another Ed Gein walking among us today? The answer is terrifyingly simple. Yes. Because sometimes the monster smiles. He waves good morning from across the street. And deep down, he truly believes he's doing the right thing. The mask of normalcy. When monsters learn to smile. An old investigator once told me, over coffee in a quiet Milwaukee diner. What makes Ed Gein terrifying isn't what he did. It's how politely he hid it. You see, Ed wasn't some knife-wielding maniac lurking in the shadows. He was the man you'd greet on your morning walk. The quiet neighbor who'd fix your fence, help you shovel snow, lend you his truck if you needed it. In Plainfield, everyone called him Gentle Eddie. He smiled. He chatted softly. He seemed harmless, almost childlike. But the part that still haunts me is how perfectly he lived between two worlds. By day, Ed was the friendly handyman. By night, he returned to that freezing house filled with human relics, where he put on his mother's skin and disappeared into madness. That's what we call compartmentalization in criminal psychology. The ability to split the self, to live as both man and monster. And Ed Gein mastered it. I've seen it in other killers. 2. The mask of normalcy. The fake warmth. The illusion of control. But Ed's case stands apart. Because he wasn't just hiding from others. He was hiding from himself. He wasn't pretending. In his mind, both versions of himself were real. One was the neighbor who helped fix fences. The other was the man who built furniture out of human skin. And to him, there was no contradiction between the two. During one interrogation, an officer asked, "Ed, do you know what you did was wrong?" He gave a faint smile and answered, as calmly as if talking about changing a light bulb, "I just wanted to make my house feel less empty." That one sentence silenced the entire room, because it revealed something truly terrifying. He had lost the ability to recognize the boundary between humanity and horror. When investigators returned to Gein's home to collect evidence, they found a chair upholstered with human skin. On the dining table, there was still a bowl of soup, a stainless steel spoon, and a cup of coffee steam still lingering. It looked as if life had continued, only it no longer belonged to the living. When those images reached the press, America was shaken. The people of Plainfield couldn't believe that Gentle Eddie, the man who taught their kids how to fix engines, who watched over their houses when they were away, was the butcher of Plainfield. I used to ask myself, what allows a man to maintain those two identities without falling apart? The answer, I think, lies in a strange survival mechanism. When the mind is too fragile to face pain, it splits itself. One half living in the light, the other in the dark. Ed Gein lived his whole life that way. A lonely man, clinging to a small illusion of normal just to avoid drowning in his own madness. But that normalcy was nothing more than a mask made of flesh. And sometimes, I wonder, don't we all wear masks? 2. Not made of skin, but of pretending. Pretending to be okay. Pretending to be strong. Pretending to be good. Just to hide the fear and emptiness underneath. The difference is, most of us still remember how to take our masks off. Ed Gein forgot how. I still remember the testimony of a witness. A woman who worked at the hardware store where Bernice Worden, Gein's final victim, disappeared. She said, that morning, Eddie came in to buy some antifreeze. He smiled and said hello. I even joked, cold day. Huh. Still out running errands? And he replied, yeah. Gotta keep the house warm. No one knew that just a few hours later, he would kill the store owner and hang her body in his shed. When I heard that story, I felt a chill run down my spine, not because of the violence, but because of the quiet. Ed Gein's evil didn't come from rage or hatred. It came from a broken mind, disguised in absolute gentleness. Someone once said, "The most dangerous kind of devil is the one who doesn't know he's a devil." Ed Gein was exactly that. He didn't run. He didn't hide because he didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. To him, everything was just a ritual, a way to make the world a little quieter, the house a little warmer, and that normalcy, the coffee, the snow shoveling, the polite greetings, was what lulled an entire town into sleeping peacefully inside a nightmare. The mask of normalcy when monsters learn to smile. An old investigator once told me, over coffee in a quiet Milwaukee diner, what makes Ed Gein terrifying isn't what he did. It's how politely he hid it. You see, Ed wasn't some knife-wielding maniac lurking in the shadows. He was the man you'd greet on your morning walk, the quiet neighbor who'd fix your fence, help you shovel snow, lend you his truck if you needed it. In Plainfield, everyone called him Gentle Eddie. He smiled. He chatted softly. He seemed harmless, almost childlike. But the part that still haunts me is how perfectly he lived between two worlds. By day, Ed was the friendly handyman. By night, he returned to that freezing house filled with human relics, where he put on his mother's skin and disappeared into madness. That's what we call compartmentalization in criminal psychology. The ability to split the self, to live as both man and monster. And Ed Gein mastered it. I've seen it in other killers. 2. The mask of normalcy. The fake warmth. The illusion of control. But Ed's case stands apart because he wasn't just hiding from others. He was hiding from himself. He wasn't pretending. In his mind, both versions of himself were real. One was the neighbor who helped fix fences. The other was the man who built furniture out of human skin. And to him, there was no contradiction between the two. During one interrogation, an officer asked, "Ed, do you know what you did was wrong?" He gave a faint smile and answered, as calmly as if talking about changing a light bulb, "I just wanted to make my house feel less empty." That one sentence silenced the entire room, because it revealed something truly terrifying. He had lost the ability to recognize the boundary between humanity and horror. When investigators returned to Gein's home to collect evidence, they found a chair upholstered with human skin. On the dining table, there was still a bowl of soup, a stainless steel spoon, and a cup of coffee steam still lingering. It looked as if life had continued, only it no longer belonged to the living. When those images reached the press, America was shaken. The people of Plainfield couldn't believe that Gentle Eddie, the man who taught their kids how to fix engines, who watched over their houses when they were away, was the butcher of Plainfield. I used to ask myself, what allows a man to maintain those two identities without falling apart? The answer, I think, lies in a strange survival mechanism. When the mind is too fragile to face pain, it splits itself. One half living in the light, the other in the dark. Ed Gein lived his whole life that way. A lonely man, clinging to a small illusion of normal just to avoid drowning in his own madness. But that normalcy was nothing more than a mask made of flesh. And sometimes, I wonder, don't we all wear masks? Too, not made of skin, but of pretending to be okay, pretending to be strong, pretending to be good, just to hide the fear and emptiness underneath. The difference is most of us still remember how to take our masks off. Ed Gein forgot how. I still remember the testimony of a witness, a woman who worked at the hardware store where Bernice Worden, Gein's final victim, disappeared. She said, that morning, Eddie came in to buy some antifreeze. He smiled and said hello. I even joked, cold day. Huh. Still out running errands? And he replied, yeah, gotta keep the house warm. No one knew that just a few hours later, he would kill the store owner and hang her body in his shed. When I heard that story, I felt a chill run down my spine. Not because of the violence, but because of the quiet. Ed Gein's evil didn't come from rage or hatred. It came from a broken mind, disguised in absolute gentleness. Someone once said, the most dangerous kind of devil is the one who doesn't know he's a devil. Ed Gein was exactly that. He didn't run. He didn't hide because he didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. To him, everything was just a ritual, a way to make the world a little quieter, the house a little warmer, and that normalcy, the coffee, the snow shoveling, the polite greetings, was what lulled an entire town into sleeping peacefully inside a nightmare. The Psychology and Fractured Soul of Ed Gein. I once heard a psychiatrist at Central State Hospital say something I've never forgotten. Ed Gein wasn't a demon. He was simply the final result of a nightmare that no one ever woke him from. If you've ever looked into Gein's eyes in those old interrogation photos, you'll notice something unsettling. No rage, no guilt, no thrill, just emptiness, a vague, hollow stare, like a man lost inside his own mind, unable to tell what's real and what's illusion, a mind imprisoned by faith and fear. Ed grew up under the iron control of his mother, Augusta Gein, a woman so devout she blurred the line between worship and domination. Every day she preached that the world was wicked, that women were vessels of sin, and that she alone was pure. To little Eddie, his mother wasn't just a parent. She was God. When he felt scared or sinful, she punished him with scripture, with prayer, with shame. When he obeyed, she rewarded him with affection, the only kind of love he ever knew. And so, in Ed Gein's mind, love and guilt fused into one. Affection became submission. Repentance became devotion. When the mother dies, faith collapses. When Augusta passed away, the house became Ed's second grave. He locked her room, covered it with sheets, and left everything exactly as it was: the bed, the teacup, the Bible on the nightstand. The house turned into a shrine, and like every desperate worshiper, he tried to resurrect his lost saint. That was when his psyche began its descent into dissociation and religious delusion. Two voices began to coexist in his head. One, the terrified boy trying not to sin. The other, the holy woman he believed he must become to cleanse the world of sin. Forensic psychiatrists called it split ego delusion, a fractured identity. Half of him still shopped for groceries and helped his neighbors. The other half at night put on his skin suit and whispered, "Mother." Obsessive rituals when the mind turns madness into ceremony. One investigator told me he arranged everything in his house with surgical precision. The chair, the bucket, the bones all had their place. If we moved something, he'd get upset like a child whose toy had been taken. That's classic obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. But in Gein, it wasn't about washing hands or counting steps. It was ritual. Every time guilt or fear overwhelmed him, he'd perform his ceremony rearranging, touching, or stitching human skin, as if soothing his soul through horror. He didn't see it as a crime. To him, it was sacred, an act of balance, a ritual to keep Mother close. The chill of a man without humanity or the silence of a pain long buried. During interrogation, Ed spoke about everything as if describing a home repair project. No emotion, no fear. One investigator wrote in his journal, "When I asked him how it felt to cut open a body, he said, 'Same as killing a chicken.'" That's when most people believed Gein was heartless, stripped of all humanity. But after reading his psychological report, I saw something else. Ed Gein wasn't emotionless. He simply no longer understood what emotions were. Empathy, guilt, affection, all of it had been crushed out of him by his mother long ago. What remained were fragments of memory, twisted together by fear and devotion. A lost saint through the eyes of a psychiatrist. One psychiatrist once called Ed Gein the saint of silence. It sounds absurd, but it's strangely fitting. Gein didn't kill out of hatred or for pleasure. He did it to please his mother, the holy figure living inside his fractured mind. In a way, he didn't act like a demon. He acted like a blind believer, convinced that his crimes were rituals of salvation. And that's what made him terrifying. When a person truly believes that evil is righteous, morality ceases to exist. The truth about Ed Gein, a distorted mirror of loneliness. I've often wondered if someone had reached out sooner, talked to Ed, gotten him help, would things have been different? Maybe. But America in the 1940s and 50s had no place for mental illness. You either prayed or you locked people away. And so, in a small, snow-covered Wisconsin town, a fractured soul slowly turned into a living nightmare. Today, when people hear the name Ed Gein, they think of horror movies, blood, gore, and madness. But for investigators like us, the most frightening thing isn't the blood or the bodies, it's the silence. The silence inside that house, untouched for years. The silence in his eyes, when he couldn't understand why everyone was afraid of him. And maybe, deep down, Ed Gein was still just a child, standing in that old room in Plainfield, whispering into the darkness, "Mom, I'm scared." The House of Secrets and the Echo of Fear. I still remember the first time I stepped into Ed Gein's home through the crime scene photos and reports. A small, lonely house in the frozen fields of Wisconsin. No light, no voices, only damp air, rot, and that eerie feeling that the walls themselves were watching you. Back then, the newspapers called it the House of Horrors. But to me, it felt more like a museum of obsession where man and monster merged into one, and the line between them disappeared. Investigators recalled having to stop several times as they went room by room, not because of fear, but because they simply couldn't believe it was real. On the table bowls made from human skulls, on the chair's upholstery stitched from human skin, in the bedroom a mask fashioned from the face of a real woman, everything arranged with disturbing precision, as if curated by a grotesque craftsman showing off his art. But the most chilling thing wasn't the evidence, it was the meaning behind it. You see, Ed Gein wasn't just killing people. He was trying to recreate his mother, the only person he ever loved, feared, and worshipped. In his notes, he wrote about wanting to wear her skin, to become her. It sounds deranged, but to a criminal psychologist, it's the ultimate collapse of identity, a desperate attempt to merge love and possession into one. A psychiatrist I once interviewed said something I'll never forget. Ed Gein didn't just kill people. He killed what was left of his own humanity piece by piece. The body parts in his home weren't trophies. They were fragments of a shattered soul, stitched together in a futile attempt to rebuild the image of his perfect mother. That's what made him both terrifying and tragic. Because beneath the horror was a broken child, trapped forever between love and terror, a product of a mother's religious fanaticism and emotional abuse. I've asked myself many times, if someone had helped him sooner, if he'd been treated, if the town hadn't shunned him, if his mother hadn't filled his head with fear and guilt, would the butcher of Plainfield have ever been born? That's the question every investigator eventually asks. Because behind every crime lies a chain of quiet causes. Psychological wounds, loneliness, and a society that only listens when it's too late. And yet, paradoxically, without Ed Gein, America might never have confronted its own darkness. His case changed criminal history. It pushed the FBI to develop criminal profiling and inspired films like Psycho, The Silence of the Lambs, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Stories that forced us to stare into the abyss of our own humanity. Some say Ed Gein was the embodiment of pure evil, but I believe he was something else. A mirror reflecting the post-war American soul, still haunted by trauma, still hiding its pain behind locked doors and smiling neighbors. If you ever drive through Plainfield today, past the quiet houses and foggy fields, you'll see peace, stillness, normalcy. But don't forget, at the calmest places, the darkness often hides deepest. And maybe the most terrifying truth of all is this: the monster was once human. A man who could love, fear, and feel lonely just like us. The trial of a monster and the legacy of a broken soul. A colleague once told me, catching a killer doesn't always bring justice sometimes. It just begins another tragedy. The trial of a monster and the legacy of a broken soul. The Ed Gein case was the perfect example of that truth. After his arrest, Ed didn't resist. He didn't run. Didn't deny anything. He just sat there silent, hollow-eyed, as if the story had already ended long before. When the police asked, "Do you understand what you've done?" Gein replied softly, barely audible, "I just wanted my mother to come back." The room went still. Some of the younger detectives had to step outside, unable to bear the strange mix of horror and pity. A man who had skinned human beings and turned corpses into furniture spoke with the fragile voice of a lost child. The psychiatric evaluation later read, "Ed Gein suffers from paranoid schizophrenia and severe gender identity disturbance. He couldn't tell the difference between reality and delusion, between the living and the dead. In his mind, his mother was still alive, watching, scolding, commanding his every move. Throughout the entire trial, Ed never got angry. He didn't cry, didn't beg. He just sat with his head down, sometimes smiling faintly, as if he'd left this world long ago. The judge declared him not guilty by reason of insanity, and Ed Gein was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. For most people, that was the end of the story. But outside the courthouse, Plainfield was seething. The townspeople whispered and fumed. They couldn't accept that someone like him could be called a patient. They wanted him hanged, burned, or locked away forever in the dark. But what lingered wasn't just his crime. It was how his existence forced America to confront itself. Newspapers called him the Butcher of Plainfield, the Ghoul of Wisconsin. But at the same time, psychologists and sociologists began asking, what created Ed Gein? They looked back at his childhood, a boy trapped in religious extremism, taught that women were sin itself, a mother who ruled with fear, a father drowned in alcohol, powerless, and a small, closed community that ignored the signs until it was too late. For the first time, America began discussing mental health as a factor in criminal behavior. The FBI went on to establish the Behavioral Science Unit, the birthplace of criminal profiling. It also paved the way for films like Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. Each one, in its own way, humanity's attempt to understand its own fear. I once told a class at Quantico, we don't make horror movies because we love blood. We make them to remind ourselves that the scariest monster always has a human face. When Ed Gein died of lung cancer in 1984, he was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, right beside his mother, the woman he loved, feared, and worshipped all his life. His grave was vandalized so many times that officials eventually removed the headstone. Locals still say that on rainy nights, a thin, quiet figure sometimes appears, laying flowers on a woman's grave. They believe it's Ed's spirit, still wandering, still begging for forgiveness that will never come. But for me as an investigator, someone who spent a lifetime staring into humanity's darkest corners, I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in wounds that were never healed. Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. He was the product of loneliness, fear, and a society that never understood what mental illness truly meant. And if we fail to learn from that, if we keep turning our backs on those who need help, then more Ed Geins will be born. In new forms, in new times, because in the end, it isn't the knives, the blood, or the screams that create horror. It's the silence of people in the face of someone else's pain. When we look into the darkness, a psychiatrist once told me something I've never forgotten. No monster is born from nothing, only children left too long in the dark. And every time I think of Ed Gein, those words echo in my mind. Because Ed wasn't just a killer. He was a distorted reflection of society itself. A mirror showing us the things we refuse to see. Isolation, prejudice, fear, and silence. Picture it. A small, peaceful town where everyone knows each other. Where people talk about corn prices and hunting season, but no one notices the lonely man at the end of the dirt road, living in a cold wooden house. No electricity, no company, just shadows and time. People thought he was strange but harmless. Until one day, the door opened, and inside was a museum of nightmares. I've seen many crime scenes, but Gein's case was different. It wasn't just blood and horror. It was a metaphor for neglect. Because sometimes, evil doesn't hide in the woods. It hides in plain sight, in the heart of a community that chooses not to look. It grows quietly, behind closed doors, wearing the mask of normalcy. And by the time we notice, it's already too late. In my case notes, I once wrote a single line after reading his confession. He didn't kill to satisfy desire, he killed to fill an empty space in his soul. After decades studying criminals, I've learned most of them never truly wanted to kill anyone. They just didn't know how to live with loneliness, pain, or the twisted beliefs planted in them since childhood. For Gein, killing was the only way he knew. To keep his mother close. It sounds insane, but in a tragic way. It was the most desperate cry for help a son could make. When Americans first read about what police found inside his house, chairs made of human skin, masks of real faces, clothes sewn from corpses, they were horrified. The press called him the Butcher, the demon of Wisconsin. But few stopped to ask, what turns a man into this? That question became the foundation of a new era in American behavioral science. The FBI began studying the minds of killers, seeking not just how they did it, but why. Because understanding the human mind can prevent more blood than any weapon ever could. I often told my students at Quantico, if you want to understand evil, don't just look at the crime scene. Look into memory, into the wounds, into what's been buried for years. Ed Gein proved that truth. He wasn't a demon. He was a flawed creation of humanity itself, of dogma, fear, isolation, and repression. I'll never justify his crimes, but I believe if we refuse to face what created him, more Ed Geins will be born, just with different faces. It could be a bullied child, a forgotten man talking only to himself, or a woman trapped in fear and faith until her mind collapses. Each Ed Gein is a warning that we can't save anyone unless we first try to understand them. I still remember that last evening leaving Plainfield. Cold wind, blowing snow. The Gein farmhouse burned to the ground. They said it was to erase the evil, but I knew no fire can burn away memory. The evil was never in that house. It was in the things we choose not to see. And maybe the most terrifying truth isn't Ed Gein himself, but the fact that any one of us, in a moment of despair or loneliness, could step across that thin line into darkness. Because the difference between a normal man and a monster is sometimes only as thin as a loneliness no one understands.